The mining station Gamma-7 hung in the darkness between two dying stars, its metal hull scarred by countless asteroid impacts. Inside the cramped corridors, alien workers from dozens of species hurried about their business, but today something was different. Today, fear hung in the recycled air like a toxic gas. Marcus Chen wiped grease from his hands with a dirty rag, listening to the panicked chatter echoing through the maintenance bay. His fellow mechanics, a mix of insectoid klaxons and crystalline vorthak, huddled together near the far wall, their translator devices buzzing with urgent whispers. "The Shadow Maw arrives tomorrow," clicked Zix-9, his compound eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights. "Command says it's here for routine inspection, but we all know what that means." Marcus kept working on the damaged mining drone, his weathered hands steady despite the growing tension around him. At 45, he'd seen enough of the galaxy's horrors to know that panicking never solved anything. Besides, what was one more monster when you'd already lost everything that mattered? The Shadow Maw. Even Marcus had heard the stories. A creature from the Outer Rim territories, standing 12 feet tall with wings that could span a small spacecraft. Its species, the Ninth Maw, were known throughout the galaxy as enforcers, debt collectors, and executioners. They called them bat dragons because of their leathery wings and razor-sharp fangs, though no one had ever seen a real bat outside of Earth's old nature documentaries. "My cousin worked on mining station Delta 12, chittered another klaxon. When the Shadow Maw came for overdue payments, it tore through the security team like they were made of paper. 37 beings died in less than 10 minutes. The Vorthak's crystalline bodies chimed with distress, their internal lights flickering in patterns that Marcus's universal translator couldn't quite parse. Fear was a universal language, it seemed. "Why don't you seem worried, human?" Zix-9 suddenly asked, his attention turning to Marcus. "Even the station commander has locked himself in his quarters. The security chief has requested immediate transfer to another sector." Marcus looked up from his work, his tired brown eyes meeting the alien's compound gaze. "What's the point of being scared? Fear won't fix this mining drone, and it won't make the Shadow Maw go away." "But surely you understand what's coming," pressed another mechanic, a slug-like Malarian whose skin had turned a pale yellow with anxiety. "The Shadow Maw doesn't just collect debts. It makes examples. It feeds on terror and suffering." "Maybe," Marcus said, returning to his work. "But I stopped being afraid of dying about 3 years ago." The aliens exchanged glances, their translator devices working overtime to convey the confusion and disbelief in their voices. How could any being not fear death? How could this human remain so calm in the face of certain doom? Marcus didn't bother explaining about Sarah and Emma, about the transport crash that had taken his wife and daughter while he was stuck on a repair job light years away. He didn't tell them about the months of drinking that followed, or the steady jobs he'd lost because grief had hollowed him out like a mining laser. They wouldn't understand that sometimes losing everything was a kind of freedom. The intercom crackled to life and Station Commander Vexthon's voice filled the maintenance bay. The Trilarian's usually confident tone was strained, barely controlled. "Attention all personnel. The vessel Death's Wing has been detected approaching our sector. Estimated arrival 14 hours. All non-essential personnel are advised to remain in their quarters until further notice." The bay erupted in frightened chatter. Some of the smaller aliens began making prayers to their various gods, while others started making plans to hide in the deepest parts of the station. Marcus just kept working, tightening bolts and replacing damaged circuits with the methodical precision of someone who had found purpose in routine. "You're insane," Zix-9 declared, backing away from the human. "That thing will kill us all and you're fixing a mining drone?" "Someone has to keep the station running," Marcus replied without looking up. "Besides, this drone's proximity sensors are fried. If I don't fix them, the next mining crew that takes it out will fly straight into an asteroid field." "What mining crew?" The klaxon's voice rose to a shrill pitch. "Do you think anyone will be alive to mine anything after tomorrow?" Marcus finally set down his tools and looked at his coworkers. Really looked at them. He saw beings who had families to go home to, dreams to fulfill, lives worth living. They had every reason to be afraid. They had something to lose. "Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe we'll all be dead by tomorrow night. But that drone will be fixed, and if anyone does survive, they'll have one less thing to worry about." The aliens stared at him for a long moment before gradually dispersing, heading to their quarters or gathering in other groups to share their fears. Marcus was left alone in the maintenance bay, surrounded by the gentle hum of machinery and the distant vibration of the station's engines. He picked up his tools and continued working. Outside the reinforced windows, the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient dance, indifferent to the terror that gripped Gamma 7. Somewhere out there, Death's wing was cutting through space toward them, carrying its monstrous passenger. Marcus Chen had lost his family, his home, and most of his hope. But he still had his hands, his tools, and his work. Tomorrow, when the Shadow Maw arrived, he would meet whatever came with the same steady calm he brought to fixing broken machines. After all, what was the worst that could happen to a man who had already lost everything? Death's wing arrived exactly on schedule, sliding out of hyperspace with the deadly grace of a predator. The massive ship was black as the void between stars, its hull designed to look like the skeletal remains of some ancient beast. Weapon arrays jutted from its surface like metallic teeth, and sensor arrays swept the area with the methodical precision of a hunter sizing up its prey. Station Gamma 7 fell silent except for the necessary hum of life support systems. In the command center, what remained of the skeleton crew monitored the approaching vessel with growing dread. Most of the senior staff had found urgent business elsewhere, leaving junior officers to face whatever was coming. Marcus was in Maintenance Bay 3 when the docking clamps engaged with a resounding clang that echoed through the station's superstructure. He didn't stop working on the atmospheric recycler he'd torn apart for cleaning. The smell of ozone and metal filings filled his nostrils as he carefully inspected each component, looking for signs of wear or damage. The airlocks cycled with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and then the footsteps began. Heavy, deliberate, the sound of clawed feet on metal decking. They echoed through the corridors like a countdown to doom, growing louder as their source moved deeper into the station. Other aliens had hidden themselves in storage compartments, sealed themselves in their quarters, or gathered in the deepest parts of the station, where they hoped the monster might not find them. The security teams that hadn't already fled were positioned at strategic choke points, though everyone knew their weapons would be useless against a Nightmare. Marcus heard the screaming start about 20 minutes after docking. It wasn't the scream of someone being killed, but something worse, the sound of pure primal terror, the kind of fear that stripped away millions of years of evolution and reduced a sentient being to their most basic survival instincts. The screams echoed through the ventilation system, followed by the sound of claws on metal and a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the station's very bones. The Shadow Maw was making its presence known. Marcus paused in his work only long enough to wipe his hands on his coveralls before diving back into the recycler. The atmospheric processor was critical to the station's operation, and 3 of its filter arrays were showing signs of crystalline buildup that would cause a complete system failure within the week. It was delicate work, requiring steady hands and careful attention to detail. The screaming moved closer. Through the maintenance bay's speakers, he could hear fragmentary communications from the command center. Commander Vexthon was trying to negotiate, his voice high and strained as he offered tribute, payments, anything to appease their visitor. The responses came in a voice like grinding stone and winter wind, speaking in the ancient Nithmore tongue that the station's computers could barely translate. Payment, insufficient, example, must be made. More screaming, this time closer. Marcus could hear the heavy footsteps in the corridor outside, accompanied by a wet, dragging sound he didn't want to think about too carefully. The lighting in the maintenance bay flickered as something large passed by the power conduits embedded in the walls. The door to the bay slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Marcus didn't look up from his work. He'd reached a critical point in the filter cleaning process, and looking away now would mean starting over from the beginning. Besides, he'd known this moment would come from the instant Death's wing had appeared on the sensors. The footsteps entered the bay, each one like a hammer blow against the deck plating. The air grew thick with a smell like copper and ozone, tinged with something wild and predatory. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees, and Marcus could feel eyes watching him with the intensity of solar flares. Still, he kept working. Human. The voice was like an avalanche-given speech, each word heavy with menace and ancient authority. Marcus could feel the vibrations through the deck plates, could sense the massive presence looming behind him. His fellow workers would have been gibbering with terror by now, probably begging for their lives or trying to run. Marcus just kept cleaning the filter array, Are you deaf, small creature? Or perhaps simple-minded? The question carried a hint of curiosity beneath the menace. As if the speaker was genuinely puzzled by this lack of reaction, Marcus carefully set down the filter component he'd been examining and reached for another, checking it for stress fractures with the same methodical care he brought to all his work. "I heard you," Marcus said without turning around. "Just trying to finish this before the whole station's air goes bad." "Give me another few minutes." Silence. The kind of silence that felt pregnant with violence. As if the universe itself was holding its breath, Marcus could feel the predator behind him struggling to process this unprecedented response. In all its centuries of existence, the Shadow Maw had probably never encountered a being that simply ignored its presence. "You dare to ignore me?" The voice rose to a roar that rattled the tools on Marcus's workbench. "I am Veltar the Shadow Maw. I have destroyed fleets. I have brought entire star systems to their knees. When I speak, galaxies tremble." "That's nice," Marcus said, installing a cleaned filter back into its housing. "But this recycler doesn't care about your reputation, and neither does the atmospheric processor. If I don't get this fixed, everyone on this station suffocates in about a week, including you if you're planning to stick around." Another silence, this one even longer than the first. Marcus could feel something shifting in the air behind him, a sense of massive wings adjusting position. When the voice came again, it was quieter, more controlled, but somehow more dangerous. "Look at me, human." It wasn't a request. It was a command backed by the authority of a creature that had never been refused anything in its existence. Marcus felt the weight of that command pressing down on him like gravity from a neutron star, demanding obedience, demanding submission. He kept working on the filter. "No," he said simply. "I'm busy." The sound that followed was unlike anything that had ever echoed through the corridors of Gamma 7. It was part roar, part shriek, part something else entirely. The sound of a predator encountering something completely outside its understanding of how the universe worked. Tool containers rattled on their shelves and the lights flickered as massive claws scraped against metal. Marcus just reached for the next filter component, his hands as steady as if he was working alone in his own workshop back on Earth. The silence stretched between them like a taut cable ready to snap. Marcus could feel the massive presence behind him, radiating heat and barely contained violence. The Shadow Maw was clearly struggling with something it had never encountered before, complete and utter indifference to its presence. "You are either the bravest being I have ever encountered," Veltar's voice rumbled like distant thunder, "or the most foolish." "Probably both," Marcus replied, examining a particularly corroded filter housing. "Though I prefer to think of it as practical. This filter's shot completely. Gonna need a replacement from storage." He set down his tools and finally turned around. For the first time in 3 years, Marcus Chen felt something other than the gray numbness that had consumed his life. Not fear exactly, but a kind of stunned recognition. The Shadow Maw was magnificent in the way that natural disasters were magnificent, terrible and beautiful, and completely beyond human comprehension. Veltar stood 12 feet tall, his body covered in midnight black scales that seemed to absorb the maintenance bay's harsh lighting. Massive wings were folded against his back, the membrane between the finger bones translucent enough to show the intricate network of blood vessels beneath. His head was elongated and predatory, filled with teeth that could shear through starship hull plating. Eyes like burning coals fixed on Marcus with an intensity that should have reduced him to a gibbering wreck. "There," Marcus said matter-of-factly. "I looked. Happy now?" Veltar's massive head tilted to one side, a gesture that would have been almost comical if not for the razor-sharp intelligence behind those burning eyes. "You show no fear? Nope. No submission? Not really my style? No respect for my power?" Marcus shrugged. "I respect that you could probably tear me in half without breaking a sweat. But respect for power and being afraid of it are two different things." The Shadow Maw's claws scraped against the deck plating as he shifted his weight, wings rustling with a sound like leather being shaken. "Explain." "Fear is about what you might lose," Marcus said, turning back to his work. "I already lost everything that mattered. My wife Sarah, my daughter Emma. They died in a transport crash 3 years ago while I was stuck on a maintenance job halfway across the sector. So what exactly are you going to threaten me with? Death? Sometimes that looks like a mercy." He picked up another filter component, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "You want to kill me? Go ahead. Want to torture me first? Probably won't be worse than the last 3 years have been. Want to destroy the station? Won't bring back my family, but at least the other folks here will stop suffering. Veltar moved closer, his massive form casting Marcus in shadow. When he spoke, his voice was quieter, almost contemplative. You speak of loss. The Nithmore understand loss, do you now? Marcus didn't look up from his work. Let me guess. Tragic backstory about your homeworld being destroyed or maybe your family killed by enemies. Very sad, I'm sure. Lots of beings in the galaxy have lost things. Most of them don't become galactic-scale psychopaths because of it. A low growl rumbled from the Shadow Maw's throat, but it lacked the murderous edge from before. You know nothing of what I have endured. You're right, Marcus agreed, finally finding a filter that was still in decent condition. I don't know your story and you don't know mine, but I know this. Whatever you lost, however much it hurt, you chose to become someone who inflicts that same pain on others. That's the difference between us. Marcus stood up, filter housing in hand, and looked directly into Veltar's burning eyes. For a moment, neither of them moved. The maintenance bay was silent except for the distant hum of machinery and the soft whisper of recycled air. You chose to become a monster, Marcus continued. I chose to fix things. Fixing things will not bring back your family, Veltar said, his voice carrying an odd note of something that might have been curiosity. No, it won't, but it might keep someone else from losing theirs. Every time I repair a life support system, I might be saving a few dozen families. Every time I fix a navigation array, I might prevent a transport crash like the one that killed Sarah and Emma. It doesn't balance the scales, but it's something. Marcus walked past the towering alien toward the storage compartment where replacement parts were kept. He half expected claws to tear through his back, but Veltar simply watched him go. The others flee from me, the Shadow Maw said. They beg. They scream. They offer me everything they possess to spare their miserable lives. You offer me nothing. What's the point? Marcus called from inside the storage compartment, his voice echoing slightly. You're going to do whatever you came here to do regardless of what I say or don't say. Might as well get this recycler fixed while we're talking. When he emerged with a new filter housing, he found Veltar studying the partially disassembled atmospheric processor with what looked like genuine interest. This device maintains breathable atmosphere for the entire station? The alien asked. One of 3 primary units, Marcus confirmed, setting the new component on his workbench. This one handles maintenance levels 5 through 12. If it fails, about 200 beings suffocate slowly over the course of 4 to 6 days. Not a pleasant way to go. Veltar's massive head turned toward him. And you repair such devices regularly? Every day. Atmospheric processors, gravity generators, water recyclers, waste management systems, reactor coolant pumps, all the unglamorous stuff that keeps people alive. Marcus began installing the new filter housing with practiced efficiency. Not exactly the kind of work that gets you into the history books, but it matters. You preserve life, Veltar said slowly, as if the concept was foreign to him. I preserve life, Marcus agreed. You end it. Guess that makes us opposites. The Shadow Maw was quiet for a long moment, watching Marcus work with an intensity that should have been unnerving. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something Marcus couldn't quite identify. Perhaps, Veltar said, we are not as different as you believe. Marcus paused in his work, filter housing half installed, and looked at the massive alien with raised eyebrows. Not as different? You're kidding, right? You just spent the last hour terrorizing everyone on this station for fun. Not for fun, Veltar corrected, his voice carrying an odd note of defensiveness. For necessity. Necessity? Marcus went back to his work, his tone skeptical. Let me guess. You had to collect some debt or enforce some contract. Very necessary, I'm sure. Really couldn't be avoided. The Shadow Maw's claws scraped against the deck plating again, but this time the sound seemed more restless than threatening. You mock what you do not understand, human. Then explain it to me, Marcus said, tightening the filter housing into place. I've got time. This recycler isn't going anywhere, and neither are we, apparently. For a long moment, Veltar said nothing. Marcus could feel the weight of the alien's gaze as he worked, could sense something shifting in the atmosphere between them. When the Shadow Maw finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. The Nithmore were not always what we are now, he began. Once we were scholars and philosophers. We built great cities among the clouds of our gas-giant homeworld, suspended in the atmosphere by technology your species has not yet dreamed of. We were artists and thinkers, devoted to understanding the mysteries of existence. Marcus kept working, but he was listening. There was something in Veltar's voice that hadn't been there before, a note of genuine pain beneath the predatory menace. For 3,000 years, we lived in peace. We explored the galaxy not as conquerors, but as students. We shared our knowledge freely with any species that wished to learn. We believed that wisdom and understanding could solve any problem, heal any wound. The filter housing clicked into place with a satisfying sound. Marcus moved on to the next component, his hands steady and sure. Sounds nice. What happened? The Void Seekers happened. Marcus had heard of them, though only in whispers and half-remembered stories. An ancient race that had supposedly consumed entire star systems before disappearing into the darkness between galaxies. Most scholars thought they were myths, cautionary tales told to frighten children. They came from the space between galaxies, Veltar continued, his voice growing darker. Beings of pure hunger that devoured not just matter and energy but consciousness itself. They fed on the thoughts and dreams and memories of every species they encountered, leaving behind empty husks that still breathed but no longer truly lived. Marcus glanced at the massive alien. And they hit your homeworld? They consumed 17 Nithmor worlds before we even understood what was happening. Billions of my people, reduced to mindless shells in a matter of days. Our philosophers and scholars tried to reason with them, tried to understand their nature and find a peaceful solution. Veltar's wings rustled, a sound like flags snapping in a harsh wind. The Void Seekers ate their minds while they were still trying to negotiate. Marcus finished with the second filter component and reached for the third. He was beginning to understand where the story was heading, and he didn't like it. By the time we realized that our peaceful nature was useless against an enemy that saw us only as food, it was almost too late. The Void Seekers had consumed most of our population, and were moving toward the core worlds. Desperate times called for desperate measures. You changed yourselves, Marcus said quietly. We made ourselves into something the Void Seekers couldn't easily consume. We abandoned our philosophy of peace and understanding. We became predators, warriors, creatures of violence and terror. It worked, barely. The few surviving Nithmor managed to drive off the Void Seekers, though at a cost that still haunts us. Veltar moved closer, his massive head lowering until it was level with Marcus's. But once you become a monster to fight monsters, human, it is very difficult to become anything else. The galaxy sees us as we made ourselves, creatures of violence and terror. And perhaps that is what we truly are now. Marcus set down his tools and turned to face the Shadow Maw directly. So you collect debts and terrorize mining stations because you can't figure out how to be anything else? We survive, Veltar said simply. As enforcers, as debt collectors, as the creatures parents tell their children about in scary stories. It is not a noble existence, but it is existence nonetheless. That's the biggest load of self-pitying garbage I've ever heard, Marcus said bluntly. Veltar's eyes flared with anger, and his claws extended with a metallic scraping sound. You dare? Yeah, I dare, Marcus interrupted, completely unfazed by the display of aggression. You want to know the difference between us? When I lost everything, I decided to spend whatever time I had left trying to keep other people from going through the same thing. When you lost everything, you decided to become exactly the kind of monster that destroyed your people in the first place. The maintenance bay fell silent except for the soft hum of machinery. Veltar's massive form loomed over Marcus. Wings half spread, claws extended, every line of his body radiating barely controlled violence. For a moment it seemed like the conversation was about to end very badly for the human mechanic. Then, slowly, the Shadow Maw's claws retracted. His wings folded back against his body. The burning intensity in his eyes dimmed to something that looked almost like confusion. I do not terrorize for pleasure, he said quietly. I terrorize because it is efficient. Fear makes beings compliant. It reduces the need for actual violence, does it though? Marcus asked, turning back to his work. How many beings have died of heart attacks or stress-related illnesses just from being in the same system as you? How many have killed themselves rather than face whatever they thought you were going to do to them? How many families have been torn apart by the trauma of your efficient methods? Veltar didn't answer, but Marcus could feel the weight of the alien's gaze boring into his back. You became a monster to fight monsters, Marcus continued, installing the final filter component. But somewhere along the way you forgot that you had a choice about what to do after the fight was over. The atmospheric recycler hummed back to life with a gentle vibration that Marcus felt through the deck plating. All indicators showed green, and the air in the maintenance bay already felt fresher as the system began cycling properly again. He started packing up his tools with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. Veltar hadn't moved or spoken for several minutes, standing like a massive statue in the middle of the bay. Marcus could sense the alien's internal struggle, could almost feel the centuries of conditioning warring against whatever new thoughts were taking root in that predatory mind. The station owes a significant debt to the hegemony, Veltar finally said, his voice carefully neutral. That is why I am here. How much? Marcus asked, wiping down his tools before placing them in their designated slots in his toolbox. 700,000 credits, plus accrued interest. The mining operation has been underperforming for the past 18 months. Marcus whistled softly. That's a lot of money. More than this station probably sees in a year. He closed his toolbox and turned to face the Shadow Maw. So what's the usual collection process? Terror, violence, maybe kill a few people to make an example? Veltar's wings rustled uncomfortably. Efficiency demands that subjects understand the consequences of default. Right. And how often does that actually result in the debt being paid? The question seemed to catch Veltar off guard. His massive head tilted slightly as if he'd never really considered the answer before. Payment is not always the primary objective. What is the primary objective, then? Examples must be made. Other debtors must understand that the hegemony's reach is long and its memory longer. Default cannot be seen as a viable option. Marcus nodded slowly. So you're not really here to collect money. You're here to destroy this station and everyone on it as a warning to others. That about right? Veltar's silence was answer enough. Here's the thing, Marcus continued, leaning against his workbench. I've been on this station for 8 months. I've gotten to know the people here. They're not evil or lazy or trying to cheat anyone. They're just trying to make a living in a universe that doesn't make it easy. He gestured toward the door leading to the rest of the station. Zix-9 has 6 younglings back on his homeworld that he's trying to put through education programs. The Malarian crew chief sends half her pay to support her sick mother. Commander Vexthon took this posting because it was the only command position he could get after speaking out against corruption in the Trilarian fleet. Marcus's voice grew quieter, more intense. These aren't faceless numbers in a ledger, Veltar. They're people with families, dreams, problems they're trying to solve. And you're going to murder them all to send a message to other people who are probably in exactly the same situation. The debts must be paid, Veltar said, but there was less conviction in his voice than before. Must they? Says who? The hegemony. The hegemony is a collection of bureaucrats and politicians sitting in comfortable offices light years away from here, Marcus interrupted. They've never worked a mining claim or tried to extract valuable materials from an asteroid field, while dodging solar flares and equipment failures. They set quotas based on theoretical maximums that don't account for the reality of what we're dealing with out here. Marcus pulled up a data pad and began scrolling through production reports. Look at this. Gamma-7's output has been declining because the easily accessible ore veins are exhausted. The remaining deposits require more sophisticated equipment and techniques that the station doesn't have funding to implement. It's not that the crew is lazy or incompetent. They're literally trying to squeeze blood from a stone with outdated tools. Veltar moved closer, his burning eyes studying the data pad with surprising intensity. These figures, they show significant effort despite declining yields. Exactly. These people are working harder than ever and getting less to show for it through no fault of their own. The hegemony's response? Send a Shadow Maw to kill them all as an object lesson. Marcus set down the data pad and looked directly into Veltar's eyes. How does that make sense to anyone? It does not have to make sense, Veltar said slowly. It merely has to be effective. Effective at what? Creating more desperate people who see violence as their only option? Destroying productive capacity that could eventually pay back the debt? Traumatizing entire sectors of space so badly that economic activity grinds to a halt? Marcus stood up and walked to the reinforced viewport that looked out into space. You know what would be more effective? Help them upgrade their equipment. Provide technical assistance to access those deeper ore deposits. Give them the tools they need to be successful instead of punishing them for circumstances beyond their control. The hegemony is not a charity, Veltar said, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. No, but it's supposedly a business organization. And good business means making decisions that maximize long-term profit, not short-term fear. Marcus turned back to face the massive alien. Dead miners don't pay debts. Destroyed stations don't generate revenue. Terrorized populations don't make good trading partners. Veltar was quiet for a long moment, his massive form still as carved stone. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost confused. You speak as if there are alternatives. There are always alternatives. The question is whether you're willing to look for them or if you're just going to keep doing what you've always done because it's easier than thinking. Marcus began gathering the tools he'd need for his next repair job. The gravity generator in Section C had been making concerning noises for the past week, and it wouldn't fix itself. Where are you going? Veltar asked. To fix a gravity generator. The rotation bearings are wearing out, and if they fail completely, everyone in Section C will either be crushed or flung into the walls when the artificial gravity cuts out. Marcus hefted his toolbox. Want to come along? Might be educational. Veltar stared at him for a long moment, clearly struggling with something. Finally, with a sound like thunder made of leather and bone, the shadow maw folded his wings and followed Marcus out of the maintenance bay. As they walked through the corridors, Marcus could hear the terrified whispers of aliens hiding in side passages and behind emergency doors. The fear was palpable, a living thing that seemed to follow in Veltar's wake like a toxic cloud. They're afraid of you, Marcus observed. Yes. How does that make you feel? Veltar was quiet for several steps. I had not considered how it felt, he finally admitted. It simply was. Marcus nodded, leading the way toward Section C. Maybe it's time you started considering it. The gravity generator in Section C was making a sound like a dying animal, a grinding, irregular whine that made Marcus wince every time it cycled. The massive device filled most of a dedicated chamber, its rotating elements spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute to create the artificial gravity field that kept everyone's feet on the deck. Veltar crouched in the doorway, too large to enter the chamber fully, watching as Marcus began his diagnostic routine. The Shadow Maw's presence was drawing curious and terrified glances from the few station personnel who couldn't avoid the area, but Marcus ignored them and focused on his work. The bearing assemblies are in worse shape than I thought, Marcus muttered, consulting his readings. If these fail completely, the whole section could become a death trap in seconds. How long to repair? Veltar asked. Done properly? About 6 hours. The whole assembly needs to be torn down, cleaned, rebalanced, and reassembled. Marcus looked up from his instruments. Why, got somewhere urgent to be? Veltar didn't answer immediately. Instead, he watched Marcus work with that same intense focus he'd shown in the maintenance bay. The hegemony expects regular reports during collection missions. And what do those reports usually say? Compliance achieved through appropriate measures. Debt resolved. Example established. Marcus started disconnecting the primary drive coupling, his movements precise despite the confined space. How long before they expect the next report? Standard protocol allows for 72 hours to complete collection activities. So you have 3 days to decide what you're going to tell them. Marcus paused in his work and looked directly at Veltar. Question is, what do you want to tell them? The Shadow Maw's claws scraped against the doorframe as he shifted position. What I want is irrelevant. I am a tool of the hegemony. Tools do not have wants. That's where you're wrong, Marcus said, returning to his work. Tools don't think. Tools don't question. Tools don't spend time talking to human mechanics about philosophy and alternative solutions. You're not a tool, Veltar. You're a person who's been pretending to be a tool for so long that you've forgotten the difference. The gravity generator's whine grew more pronounced as Marcus began shutting down the rotation assembly. Throughout Section C, magnetic boots activated automatically as the artificial gravity field fluctuated. Tell me about your family, Marcus said suddenly. Veltar's massive head snapped toward him. What? Your family. Before the Void Seekers. You mentioned that the Neathmore were scholars and philosophers. What did you study? Did you have a mate, younglings? That is not relevant to humor me, Marcus interrupted. I'm going to be stuck in here for the next 6 hours. Might as well pass the time with conversation. Veltar was silent for so long that Marcus thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been since he'd arrived on the station. I was a student of atmospheric dynamics. My people's cities floated in the upper atmosphere of gas giants. and I was fascinated by the complex interactions between air currents, magnetic fields, and the city's stabilization systems. Marcus smiled slightly as he began dismantling the bearing assembly. Sounds like engineering. We might have more in common than I thought. I had a mate, Silnara. She was a composer who created music by manipulating sound waves through controlled atmospheric pressure changes. Her concerts could be heard across entire continents. Veltar's voice grew distant, remembering. We had two younglings, Kethmore and Ysandra. They were beginning their own studies when the Void Seekers came. Marcus finished gently. Yes. Marcus worked in silence for a while, giving Veltar time to process whatever memories had surfaced. The bearing assembly was in worse condition than he'd expected. Metal fatigue, contamination, and simple wear had reduced it to barely functional status. What happened to them? Marcus asked finally. Silnara was on the primary research station when the Void Seekers attacked. The younglings were with her. Veltar's voice was carefully controlled, but Marcus could hear the pain beneath the words. By the time I reached them, they were gone. Their bodies remained, but their minds, their souls, everything that made them who they were, consumed. Marcus stopped working. I'm sorry. I held them in my arms for 3 days before I accepted that they would never return. Their eyes still moved, they still breathed, but they no longer recognized me. They were empty shells animated by basic biological functions, nothing more. The gravity generator chamber fell silent except for the distant hum of other machinery. Marcus sat back on his heels, his tools forgotten for the moment. Is that when you changed? He asked quietly. That is when I understood that the universe is not kind or reasonable or fair. It is a place where monsters exist, and the only way to survive is to become something that monsters fear. Marcus nodded slowly. I can understand that. When Sarah and Emma died, I wanted to tear the universe apart with my bare hands. I wanted to find someone to blame, something to fight, some way to make the pain make sense. But you did not. No, I didn't. You want to know why? Marcus resumed his work, his hands steady despite the emotional weight of the conversation. Because I realized that becoming a monster wouldn't bring them back. It would just create more pain for other people, more families torn apart by violence and fear. So instead you fix things. I fix things, Marcus confirmed. Every atmospheric recycler I repair, every gravity generator I maintain, every life support system I keep running. It's my way of fighting back against the chaos. I can't bring my family back, but I can try to keep other families together. Veltar shifted in the doorway, his massive form casting complex shadows across the chamber. And you believe this makes a difference? I know it does. Every day I keep these systems running is another day that 200 people get to live normal lives. They get to work, to love, to hope, to dream. They get to be with their families. Marcus's voice grew stronger. That's my war against the darkness, Veltar. Not through fear or violence, but by preserving the things that make life worth living. Even for beings you barely know, especially for beings I barely know. The universe already took away the people I loved most. I'll be damned if I'm going to let it take away anyone else while I still have the strength to prevent it. Marcus pulled the damaged bearing assembly free and set it aside, revealing the intricate mechanical components beneath. The thing is, Veltar, you could do the same thing. Instead of being the monster that destroys families, you could be the one that protects them. I am a shadow maw. Fear is what I am. Fear is what you've chosen to be, Marcus corrected. But choice works both ways. You can choose to be something else. Veltar was quiet for a long moment, watching Marcus work on the delicate machinery. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. What would you suggest? 3 days later, Marcus was back in Maintenance Bay 3, installing a new power coupling for the main reactor when Veltar found him. The Shadow Maw moved more quietly now, his massive form somehow less menacing than it had been when he first arrived. The other station personnel still gave him a wide berth, but the paralyzing terror that had gripped Gamma 7 had begun to fade. The hegemony has received my report, Veltar announced without preamble. Marcus didn't look up from his work. And what did you tell them? That Station Gamma 7 has entered into a restructured payment plan that will satisfy the outstanding debt within 18 months, with technical assistance provided to improve mining efficiency. Marcus paused in his work and looked at the massive alien. Technical assistance from who? From an independent contractor with extensive knowledge of atmospheric engineering and mining operations. Veltar's eyes held something that might have been amusement. It seems that my previous academic specialization has practical applications after all. You're going to help them access the deeper ore deposits? The principle is the same whether you're stabilizing a floating city or maintaining atmospheric pressure in a mine shaft. The mathematics of fluid dynamics apply universally. Veltar moved closer, settling into a position where he could watch Marcus work. I have already identified 17 modifications to their extraction systems that should improve yield by 40 to 60%. Marcus smiled. The first genuine smile he'd felt in months. And the hegemony bought this? Debt collection through asset improvement rather than asset destruction is sound business practice. The administrators were intrigued by the prospect of turning a failing operation into a profitable one. Veltar's voice carried a note of dry humor. It helps that I have a reputation for effectiveness. They trust my judgment. What about your reputation as the terrifying Shadow Maw? Sometimes reputation can be a useful tool, even when applied in unexpected ways. The mining consortium that holds the secondary contracts for this sector has agreed to extend more favorable terms. They seemed eager to accommodate my suggestions. Marcus laughed, a sound of genuine amusement that echoed through the maintenance bay. You're still using fear as a tool, just pointed in a different direction. Efficiency remains important, Veltar said solemnly, but there was definitely amusement in his burning eyes now. The difference is that now I am using it to protect rather than to destroy. They worked in comfortable silence for a while, Marcus installing the new components while Veltar observed and occasionally asked technical questions. The Shadow Maw's understanding of engineering principles was impressive, and Marcus found himself explaining not just what he was doing, but why certain approaches worked better than others. There's something I don't understand, Marcus said as he tightened the final connection. The hegemony isn't going to let you just become a freelance engineering consultant. You're too valuable as an enforcer. You are correct. I remain bound to the hegemony's service for the foreseeable future. Veltar's expression grew thoughtful. But there is no regulation that prevents me from choosing how to interpret my orders. Debt collection can take many forms. And if they catch on to what you're really doing, then I will deal with that situation when it arises. For now, I am successfully completing my assigned missions while causing significantly less collateral damage than my predecessors. The administrators appreciate efficiency above all else. Marcus powered up the new coupling and watched the indicators cycle through their startup sequence. Everything showed green. What about the next station? The next debt collection mission? I have been giving that considerable thought. Veltar stood up, his massive form stretching toward the ceiling. I believe there are opportunities to apply similar principles elsewhere. Turn failing operations into profitable ones. Restructure debts into manageable payments. Provide technical assistance where needed. You're talking about changing the entire enforcement paradigm. I am talking about choosing to build rather than destroy. Veltar looked down at Marcus with those burning eyes. You showed me that such choices are possible even for creatures like me. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a warmth he hadn't experienced since before the transport crash. For the first time in 3 years, he felt like he had accomplished something that mattered beyond just keeping machinery running. What about your people? The other Nithmore? That is a longer conversation for another day. Change, I have learned, often begins with a single individual making a different choice. Veltar moved toward the bay's exit, then paused. The station's mining output has improved by 37% since I implemented the first round of modifications. Commander Vexthun believes they will meet their revised quotas ahead of schedule. That's good news. Indeed. It means that families will continue to have homes, younglings will continue to receive education, and beings like Zix-9 will be able to support their dependents. Veltar's voice carried a note of something that might have been satisfaction. It is a more rewarding form of efficiency than I had previously experienced. Marcus watched the Shadow Maw prepare to leave and felt an unexpected pang of something. Not quite friendship, but a connection to another being who understood loss and had chosen to do something constructive with it. Veltar, he called out. The massive alien turned back toward him. When you see your family again, in whatever comes after this life, you'll be able to tell them that you chose to become someone they could be proud of. Veltar was quiet for a long moment, his burning eyes fixed on the human mechanic who had somehow managed to crack through centuries of conditioning and pain. "Perhaps," he said finally, "and perhaps you will be able to tell yours that you never stopped fighting for the things they would have wanted you to protect." After Veltar left, Marcus returned to his work with a lightness in his step that he hadn't felt in years. The power coupling hummed with smooth efficiency, the atmospheric recyclers maintained perfect air quality throughout the station, and the gravity generator in Section C operated without so much as a whisper of complaint. Outside the reinforced windows, the stars wheeled in their ancient dance, indifferent as always to the small dramas and triumphs of the beings who lived among them. But on Station Gamma 7, 200 individuals continued to breathe work, love, and hope because a human mechanic had chosen to fix things instead of breaking them, and a monster had remembered that he had once been something else. Marcus Chen had lost everything that mattered to him, but in helping someone else find their way back from the darkness, he had discovered that even in a universe full of chaos and pain, there was still room for small acts of grace, and sometimes, if you were very lucky, those small acts could change everything.